afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get started with our Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee session. Today we have 3 items, and we're going to take them a little bit in different order. So we're going to do spending affordability guidelines, and then we'll go on to Bill 11-19, and then lastly we'll take up the discussion on the property disposition process, because that might be a little bit more open-ended. So we're going to begin with spending affordability guidelines for the FY21 capital budget and FY21 to 26 capital improvements program. No, you're good. So as a reminder, Section 305 of the Charter requires that the Council set spending affordability guidelines for capital budget each year and to establish by law the process and criteria. And then subsequent law requires the Council to set guidelines for capital budgets by resolution biannually and no later than the first Tuesday in October in odd numbered years. So October 1st in 2019 in this case. And then also as the title of the law indicates, the guidelines are related to how much the Council believes that it can afford. Not how much it might be needed. Yeah. Dr. Orland likes to remind us of that all the time. And so in this packet, I think we'll find that Dr. Orland as well as Mr. Smith have outlined 3 options for us to consider. The executive's recommendation, a staff recommendation, and also a more conservative approach. And we'll talk about what our staff has deemed as a possible scenario for us to consider, which is one that would strike a balance between what we need and what we can afford, but always to keeping in mind this affordability issue. I think also we want to be very mindful that while we understand and can't deny the importance of those projects in our capital budget and the infrastructure needs that we have, we are very cognizant of not overburdening ourselves with debt and really working hard, as we have been discussing for a number of years, to start to ramp down this issue of our growing debt. And I think that what we'll discuss today will continue to take us in that direction. And, you know, even though it's not a drastic shift, which we know it's also not reasonable or practical, I think that every year we should commit, as we have already started to do, to ramp down as much as possible. And so that will be the conversation I think that we should be having, and sort of with that lens really begin to have these discussions. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Orland to walk us through the packet and any recommendations, and then we will also engage in a conversation with folks with the administration who are here to see where we end up. Turn it over to you.
Gene Smith and I wrote the packet. I just want to acknowledge Jacqueline Carter from the Department of Finance and Mary Beck from Office of Management Budget has joined us at the table. This is the first step, really, in the development of the fiscal year 21 to 26 CIP. It's basically the size of the pie, and after you've decided what the size of the pie is, you can spend the rest of the time figuring out how to divide up that pie. It's actually not the entire pie. The general obligation bonds and park and planning bonds together constitute a little bit less than half of the total CIP. There's state aid, there's other revenue bonds, there's all kinds of special funding sources, but the part that's backed by general tax debt or tax debt are these 2 forms of bonds. Just again, very briefly, in terms of the background, there are 6 guidelines that by law you have to set. The guideline for FY21 for GO bonds, the guide for FY22 for GO bonds, and the guideline for the 6-year total of 21 through 26 for GO bonds, and the same 3 for park and planning bonds, bonds issued by the Park and Planning Commission to fund local parks in their CIP. And they are the ones that issue those bonds, the Park and Planning is. We also refer to targets. These are the bond amounts in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th years of the CIP. You typically set those as well. Those those aren't controlled by law. You're just basically saying this is the pattern that we'd like to say. So you hear the terms guidelines and targets, that's the distinction. And by law, you do have to, as a council, approve the guidelines by next Tuesday, October 1st. So this is the committee's opportunity to make its recommendations. We always look at 5 particular indicators. We've looked at these for the last almost 30 years now. And each of these indicators, they're listed at the bottom of page 2, have a threshold which we're supposed to try to not exceed, not get worse than. And if you look at some of the tables in the back of the amongst the attachments, particularly on the graphs on circle 8 through 11, you'll see the history of these thresholds and whether we've met them or not over the years, going way back into the 80s even in some cases. We have, for GO bonds, to talk about that first, have identified 3 scenarios. Obviously, there's a million scenarios you could have, but we identified 3 for you to think about. One is actually the guidelines and targets that were introduced to sort of kick off the process to get public comment on, and that kept the same 4 guidelines and targets for FY21 through 24 as in the approved CIP from last May.
And that's on page 5.
And that's on page 5. The table 2 at the bottom, page 5. $320 million in FY21, $310 in FY22, $290 million in 23 and 24, and then just extrapolating out, keeping the 290 in 25 and 26 was the assumption, just for introduction purposes. The county executive is actually recommending that exact set of numbers, the total of $1,790 million over the 6-year period. We looked at 2 other scenarios which really sort of modestly ramped down, as Council President mentioned. The first, scenario 2, is the same in the first 4 years, so in other words, keeping the same levels as in the approved CIP for FY21 to 24, but reduces or sets the FY24 and 25 and 26 targets at $280 million rather than $290. Does it make much of a difference in terms of these indicators? No, not until the very end of the CIP, and it's only a few hundredths of a %, but it's part of this slow turning of the ocean liner so that we eventually get to the point where we're within the thresholds for all these indicators. In terms of the indicators themselves, we're doing better on some of them. The debt as percentage of income is doing pretty well now. Debt as a percentage of assessable base is still not good overall, but it's better than it has. We actually meet the threshold in a few years. The one where we're really, well, debt per capita is way over where it should be, but the key one that the bond houses look at and the council has looked at really more than the others is debt and leases as a percentage of the general fund revenue. And if you look at circle, I'm looking for the guide. Well, 10 is the chart that Gene put together, which shows the where those indicators have shown up over the last several years. You see, starting around FY12 or so, we've been above the 10% level, which is where we should be, and it's hovering pretty high. It's hovering up around 12%, which is very high. You see, towards the back end of the upcoming CIP, it begins to drop again, but the idea is to try to get it back down to under 10 as soon as feasible. There was, back in the 1992, a huge cut the council took. It cut basically 25-30% of the CIP to sort of set the to set this well, and it put us in a good spot for about 10 or 12 years in terms of keeping all these indicators in a good place, but we eventually built back up again, and this is where we are. If you look on circle, trying to find it now, let's see, the actual chart showing the debt capacity analyses for the 3 scenarios. Here we go. On circle 4, you can turn your attention to that. So under scenario 1, you'll see in the top part of the table, the bolded line, debt service plus long-term leases plus short-term leases, the percentage of general fund revenue. You can see that we're supposed to be at 10%, but it's at 11.54% in FY20. It rises to a high of 11.94% in FY23, and then begins to drop back down to the point where by FY26, it's still above 11%, but getting better. Scenario 2, and the scenario 1, again, is what the executive's recommending. Scenario 2 drops it by $10 million in 25 and 26 and does marginally better in those last 2 years in this indicator, really in the last year, FY26. And we looked at a third scenario, which again is a further relatively modest reduction. It reduces the FY23 and 24 levels from 290 to 285, and we reduce the 25 and 26, or set the 25, 26 at 275 instead of 280 or 290. Gene and I are recommending scenario 2. Again, as Ms. Navarro mentioned at the very beginning, the idea over the last few years is the council's trying to ramp down the CIP, but in a very gentle way to try to get us into a good place in terms of these indicators without causing undue disruption to the CIP. Typically what happens in the CIP is when you approve it, there is a very, very large capital reserve in the last 2 years of the CIP. So cutting it by 10 million below what it would be otherwise, or even 15 million, probably won't make much of a difference at all in terms of what you could program. Just, I know you always have an eye out for a need, and you're out an eye out for need, but it is something that, nose out for need. All your senses are looking at need. I can taste it even.
Never been considered here.
There you go. But we think that it's a good step to just continue to bring it down a bit. I think it also sends a good message to New York. So that's our recommendation for GO bonds, and I recommend that we deal with that before we go to the park and planning, because it's a different set of issues. Unless, Gene, do you have anything else you want to add? Or
Anything Ms. Beck and Ms. Carter want to add?
I think that we're just appreciated working with the staff. I think we're all trying to sort of move in the right direction. Again, as Glenn said, though, without sort of undue harm.
Okay. Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you, Council President, and I want to thank the staff for the recommendation, which I think is really thoughtful. Also want to thank Ms. Beck, who we had a very robust and thoughtful conversation about this as well. And as I said in the private meeting, and I'll say publicly, I think both the executive recommendation and the staff recommendation are basically the same philosophy with a slightly different approach to that same philosophy. And so I think that there's more consensus here than conflict. It's a question of, on the margins, how to kind of fill in the detail, and I appreciate that. I think we're all on the same page here, and I just do want to thank my colleagues here who, when we look at the snapshot of debt and some of the targets and where we are, we're not where we would like to be. But if we look at the story of where the debt has been and where it is going, the story tells a much better tale of the commitment that has been made to slowly wean down our debt. And I think it's something that is often lost in the public conversation about this. And I think it's important to bring it up in this, that this has been a methodical and slow and thoughtful and deliberative approach to how we bring our debt into line with what the reality is. I think that we do face challenges and we need to address those challenges. But I think, in particular, the Council President and Vice President on this committee have really taken the lead on that and have really, made sure that we stayed in line with that. And it has been a collaborative approach, I think, over the years with the executive branch. And I haven't been here for that, but I strongly support that. And I think we have an opportunity now to continue what the story has been and make sure to Dr. Orland's point that we are sending the message that we continue to be committed to that long process of slowly bringing this down. And so I'm personally supportive of the council staff recommendation. I think, again, it's just a slight variation of what the same philosophy is of slowly bringing this down. And I just want to express my appreciation to everybody involved, especially my colleagues, for their commitment to this long and steady approach. It's a big ship that needs to be turned in a very deliberate way so it doesn't create a tremendous amount of disruption. And I certainly agree with Ms. Beck on that point. I think that the council staff recommendation reflects that and is in keeping with what has been the longstanding approach of this committee for many years. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Katz.
Thank you very much, Council President. I guess you always have to question whether it's chair or president when we're sitting here. First off, thank you to the staff. You did a wonderful job. It's a great packet that you gave us. And bottom line is, I'm okay with scenario 2. I like scenario 3 as well, but because I want to bring down debt as fast as we can. But I realize at this point, at this moment, that scenario 2 probably is the better of the scenarios. I did question when I met with Glenn, I did question whether or not we can increase the pay go and have it in commensurate with the reduction in bonds. And maybe someday we should look at that as well so that we can start to get our debt down even faster. But we have a lot of needs, and they're not just wants, they're needs. And I think this is the only way right now with scenario 2 that we can work towards slowly getting things done in the right way. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I also want to, thank Dr. Moreland as well as Mr. Smith and, the collaborative nature of this effort. I do remember vividly when we had that conversation about having to steer this ship in a different direction, and it felt so overwhelming. But we also discussed that if we began to send that signal and began to do it in a thoughtful way, that we could get there. I also think that it's very auspicious that we will be having a meeting with our delegation to also be able to share some of these particular challenges that we face, because we know the school construction is so important, and we want to work with our delegation in order to also address, some of those issues of those other pots of money that we would like to be able to access in order to be able to respond to this issue of the need piece. But, it is important for all of us to know that it's not that we don't want to do more, is that we have to be very cognizant and mindful of issues of debt, and we want to be as responsible as possible, fiscally responsibly as possible. So I think that, this should be another piece of that conversation, just to also let them know that we're working on this piece from this perspective, and we'll be advocates and working with them to send as much information and send this message also to the state in terms of what else we can access to help us. But I'm also comfortable with scenario 2.
Thank you. Before we go to park and planning bonds, I just want to have one small comment to follow up from Mr. Katz's point. Remember, these guidelines that you're setting now are maximums. It's not likely, but it's possible, it's plausible that in FY 21 or 2021, let's say, that maybe not the entire $320 million will be needed in the CIP, or it's maybe even less possible, but it's plausible that maybe there's some additional money in operating budget revenue that could be used to supplant. So it's not likely, but at least with what you're doing today does not, and what the council, if they affirm it on Tuesday, doesn't preclude that possibility.
We understand.
Okay. Park and planning bonds, a little different story. If you look on page 7, you'll see the sort of the history of the last almost 20 years in terms of the 6-year guideline for park and planning bonds. They've actually grown pretty slowly, especially in the last 10 years. It's only gone from 30 million, 37.5 million to 39.5. And the county executive is recommending a very slight increase from what was the approved guidelines from last year. Basically, he's calling for what was introduced, I think, by the council, which was 6.6 million a year in FY21, and in 22 and 23, and 6.7 million per year in 24, 25, and 26. Planning board, Mr. Anderson and Mr. O'Reilly are here. recommending increasing those guidelines and targets to 8 million a year for a total of 64 million. And they can speak to why they're, in more detail as to why they're asking for more money, but basically in the discussions at the board at least, not so much in the testimony to you, but in the board, was the intent is to try to spend this additional money mostly on infrastructure maintenance projects. With the idea that it could potentially reduce operating and maintenance costs. And I know we say, and we mean that this is supposed to be about affordability, not need. But if you look on Circle 3, in the small print, Circles 1 through 3 is the law, spending affordability law. And on Circle 3, under the middle part of the page, says affordability indicators. It says adopting the guidelines the council should consider amongst other relevant factors. If you go down to letter J, potential operation and maintenance costs relating to debt finance projects. So the argument, at least it was made in the board's work session, was that if we do more of these kinds of projects, it could actually save and should save some operating and maintenance costs, and so that might offset, or at least substantially offset, the additional debt service. The executive's argument is the general worry about increasing debt. We're actually are ramping down the debt for GO bonds, and the concern is whether or not the park and planning tax could afford a higher debt level as being recommended by the board, and should not be able to. There might be requests down the line to increase the park and planning tax, which, because it's part of the charter limit calculation, would then impinge upon what you can do with the general fund. So just to get our recommendation out, we're sort of in the middle on this. We think the planning board makes a really good point about the potential for operating and maintenance cost savings if, in fact, the kinds of projects that are being paid for with this additional 1.3 million a year in FY21-22, for example, are used for these kinds of projects. But we would rather try that just in the first 2 years, which is really the only years that really matter right now for the kind of projects they're talking about, because these are all one-year projects, PLAR, roof replacement, refreshers, this kind of thing. And let's see how it happens, see how it goes. I mean, there are two things that might work against it. One is, even though the board is probably going to recommend a CIP with infrastructure maintenance as being the increase, the council might say, no, I want to do that additional park. And if you do that, that's of course going to add operating and maintenance costs, and that sort of works against the argument. The other thing is, we don't really know how much money would be saved by the operating and maintenance. Would it be enough to offset the debt service? And in the conversation we had with Mr. Friedson, he pointed out, and we agree, that 2 years from now, which is the next time you look at the guidelines, we're only going to have a few months of data, because remember, FY21 is the first year of this additional money being spent. Maybe the projects get finished in the spring, and then you'll only have until September to know, was there really an operating and maintenance cost savings in those months compared to the debt service that was added. But nevertheless, if that could be monitored, we might have some indication as to whether or not the strategy works. If we feel like it is working, then the next CIP, 23 through 28, perhaps should go to $8 million a year from that point on. So our recommendation is to go to $8 million in FY21 and 22, but to leave 23, 24, 25, and 26 as the executive had recommended, which would be 6.6, 6.7, 6.7, 6.7, and monitor what happens over the next 2 years to see whether or not there should be a change when we get to the FY23 years and beyond.
Okay, thank you. Any comments, Mr. Anderson?
If I could just make a couple points, then I'll turn it over to my colleagues here. First, I wanted to emphasize that even though at the public hearing we talked a lot about the projects that are on the chopping block if we can't get a bump in the affordability guidelines, we do understand this is about affordability. And to that point, we believe $120,000 increase to the debt service that has come out of the operating budget is very manageable. It's very modest. We don't think that there's any basis for being concerned that that's we think that's a very responsible position to take, and I hope you'll be comfortable with that as well, moving it to moving it to 8 million a year for the duration of this CIP cycle. The second point I wanted to make is that, and Glenn has acknowledged this, that we believe there are cost savings, but they're not going to be recovered in the first few months or even the first couple of years. I think we will be able to document some, but I think the appropriate basis of comparison is over the life cycle of the asset that's financed with the borrowing. Can you show that there's reduced operating costs? It's not just a question of, if the roof collapses, then the park activity building is not usable, but you're going to have things, if you wait until the roof is leaking and you cause major property damage to the interior of the building, then you've increased costs, and not only is it not available to the public to enjoy, but then you've incurred an additional expense. And that's true of a lot of these things: culverts, parking lots, small bridges in parks. All these things, when they go, you've got to respond to that, and you're going to spend more money trying to fix the damage than if you'd just gotten on top of it in the first place. The last point I want to make is that we are completely out of the business of big capital projects in local parks. Hillendale is ongoing, but these other projects, even the ones where we're proposing some kind of incremental refresher, are really about maintaining the assets, replacing some playground equipment and some other infrastructure in the parks. There will be more than a fresh coat of paint, but it's not as though these are not $5-10 million big projects. And you have been extremely supportive, you and all your colleagues, of moving in this direction, saying no to some of the more ambitious ideas that some people understandably have in the community, because you've recognized that we need to get this under control, and we can't be biting off these giant projects that are extremely costly, and so we can only do a few projects in the time, probably in our lifetimes. We are, I believe, really managing these efficiently. We're getting a lot done with a little money, and we're doing it in a way that is going to not only save maintenance costs, but are going to make sure that our park system continues to add economic value as well as the other benefits the park system provides. I don't want to preside over a slow decline in the park system, and I know you don't either, and we really need to get to 8 million. I think if we're going to take a chunk out of some of these long-standing needs that the park system has had just to keep up with replacing some of these assets that are falling apart. And with that, I would turn it over to Mike and Carl.
Mike Riley, Director of Parks. Great to be with you. So Glenn and Mary have trained me well over the years that this is a discussion about affordability, not need. My mind as an implementer, of course, goes right to the need side of the equation. But in my point of view, in looking at all this, and looking at the relatively small park bond SAG we're requesting in the first year of the CIP of $8 million compared to the broader county and all your other priorities at $320 million, to me it's really less of a conversation in the park bond side about overall affordability as to relative priority of investment in the parks. And as Chair Anderson said, the two areas that we're looking to spend this increased allocation of park bonds is in our PLR programs, things like our playgrounds and our courts. As we came and talked to you a few weeks ago, we really have an equity lens on selecting the locations for these projects that can mean so much to the community that they're in. We get a lot of referrals from your staff from constituent issues about, when is my playground going to be renovated? Why is my court cracked and not in good shape? And we do our best to try to remedy those. But the reality is we have backlogs throughout all our PLR programs. And then the other big program that we're so into, as the chair said, is our Park Refresher Program, where we try to go into communities and renew their park at a modest cost, not a great big brand new award-winning project as we used to do a little bit more in the past, but to spread the wealth a little bit more equitably and renew the park. As I look at the list of projects, they're all around the county. We have projects in East County, we have projects in Long Branch, projects in historically black communities in Kengar, and Scotland. So it just simply means the less park bonds we have, those projects stretch out more. We might have to scale down on the scope and scale of them. But on the need side, I just want to convince you the need is there. And if you do accept Glenn's recommendation to just go the first 2 years, in addition to us, and we certainly agree, we will monitor maintenance and operating cost savings. We'll do our best to compile data so that you'll have that available the next cycle. I just ask that as you come to some of these ribbon cuttings for these projects over the next few years, just consider the bang for the buck that they're delivering for the communities they're in. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could add just one more point. Mr. Anderson mentioned the $120,000 more per year. It's cumulative. So if you do $8 million in the first year rather than 6.7, that adds $20,000 a year each year for the next 20 years. But if you can do 8 million and then 8 million and then 8 million and then 8 million, then it's 240,000 the second year, 360. And you can, at the end, you can see on Circle 21, by FY26, we're talking about over 700,000 a year in additional debt service. So it's not an insignificant amount if you're going to continue at 8 million a year. And so if you go with 8 million in the first 2 years, it's already going to be around $240,000 or so a year you'd be adding in the later years. And then if you decide to go 2 years from now to go to 8 million, it will be back to that higher number again over a longer period of time. So it's not as insignificant as you might think.
I understand. Anything else you would like to add?
I think that's really just the issue for us is that I think Parks has done a wonderful job with the refreshers. It's been really very wonderful, well received. I think their debt service has gone up by about 1.5 million over the last 5 years already, just due to some of the implementations that they've had and bond issuances. And as Glenn mentioned, it really comes down to the county government and parks to balance the budget in the downturns. And it's just a matter of, what cushion do we have to do that? And I realize they feel their numbers are small compared to the larger county, but we have to pay for everything else. So.
And I forgot to mention, Mr. Hucker actually sent you a memo supporting the board's position on this. If you don't have it, I have extra copies.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. Any comments from my colleagues? Councilmember Cass.
Thank you very much. I actually am going to support Glenn's suggestion. I think it's twofold. I think that we are going to save money. I believe we're going to save money by the refresh for the parks themselves, and that we're going to lower maintenance. And of course, it would be an absolute shame for any park in Montgomery County not to be kept up to its highest and best standard and use. So I think we can see for the first 2 years, it's an affordable point for the first 2 years. And then we'll come back and we'll see where we are at that point. We'll know the savings, which I believe will be there. And it doesn't stop at that point. We can then do it in an incremental basis. So I'm okay with Glenn's suggestion.
Thank you. Councilmember Feason.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. I'm happy to go along as well with the staff recommendation. I do, though, think it's important. A couple things. One, proud to be the lead for parks on the council. We are so lucky to have the 37,000 acres of parkland, the 422 parks that we now have. It is one of the crown jewels of the quality of life that we have in Montgomery County, and allowing ourselves to be able to activate those spaces is really important to make sure that we are taking care of the assets that we have. That's maintenance as we go through from the operational side, but it is also on the capital side doing the type of refreshes within reason. I think the shift that has been taken in recent years is a better approach to that, but I do think it's important that as I believe Chair Anderson has mentioned in a previous setting, that we don't want grandchildren playing on the same playground equipment that their grandparents played on. And I think the refresh allows that to happen. And so, part of fiscal stewardship is making sure that we are taking care of the assets that we have and the money that we've already spent. And I think Parks is an example of that. I can speak to the Battery Lane park that was just refreshed for a relatively modest amount of money, in all things considered. It's made a huge impact just on the activation of the space, and I walk through it on a daily basis. It's pretty much my gateway to get into downtown Bethesda, and there are a lot more young families, a lot more kids. The number of people who are playing basketball and playing tennis and using the playground is dramatically different than it was a year ago. And so, that is, that's money that we've already spent to acquire that land, to take care of that land for a long period of time, and to be able to put equipment and to take care of the grounds in a way that actually utilizes it is an example of making sure that we're putting good money after good money. And so I think that there's a balance to that as well. I do appreciate Dr. Oyland's point that, and the reiteration by Chair Anderson that, we're talking about long-term savings, and the idea in a few months that you would realize the costs is somewhat unrealistic. And so I think it's important to set those expectations. I think it is incumbent upon us to reassess this after a year or 2 years. But I think that we need to be realistic about what we're looking for and what we expect, and that the guidelines specifically say potential for ongoing savings. It doesn't say demonstration in the last few months or demonstration in the last few years, and so we just need to be very clear of what we're looking for. But I think this strikes the right balance once again to continue what we're doing, make sure that we are investing our money in a way that actually allows us to realize the goals that we have, but in a way that we can actually afford. So appreciate it.
Yeah, I think it's important to reiterate that this is really a compromise between what the executive was recommending and what Park and Planning was requesting. I think that this strikes a balance that we can revisit if we need to. I think that there's no need to be on the record about the commitment of this council when it comes to supporting our parks and the planning department. This issue of equity is one that we have been tracking for a very long time. It's nothing new, and we will continue to do that. I think also this is a council that has been, very much on record when it comes to expanding our housing types. We just unanimously adopted, ADU ZTA, and I know this morning on WAMU you were quoted as saying that you didn't think that this county, I don't think you were referring to the council, I hope, but the quote was that you didn't think that the county really had the potential of moving forward with this issue of the challenge of housing. I take issue with that because I think that this council has demonstrated that commitment, and we're going to continue to do that, and that's when I think so much about the condition of our parks and the availability and the opportunity for us to create more opportunities, because as we move forward with our housing, targets and goals and things like that, we're going to have to make sure that there are amenities like our parks and all of that. So I think that that is going to continue, but this is an opportunity for us to take a look and see whether, these PLR investments and things of that nature really are producing the savings that we need. And if they're, not immediately, we can come back and revisit, because I think this county, both the previous councils, and this council have been on record as being super, super supportive and understand the role that especially parks is playing in economic development and quality of life and in our neighborhoods. So I just want to make sure that's on record, is that, I think this is a good compromise between what the executive was recommending and what we should adopt. So.
Since you brought it up, I just thought I should say I haven't seen or heard the WAMU story, but for the record, I think the council was very forward-thinking in adopting the ADU legislation, and certainly don't question the council's understanding or commitment to the idea that we need more housing. We need a lot more housing.
Absolutely.
We need affordable housing. We need market rate housing. We need all kinds of housing. I think.
So you may want to talk to them, because the way it was framed, and we know how that happens.
Yeah.
So
we're crystal clear.
Yeah, right after unanimous adoption of something that was quite controversial, then they turn to you, and then you're saying you don't think that the county is.
Yeah, I don't know where that came from. I was on a ULA.
But we are, and but I just wanted to make the connection that when it comes to things like investing in our parks and maintenance and things like that, it goes hand in hand.
Yes, and you've been fantastic.
Yeah.
All of you. Mr. Friedson has attacked it with a enthusiasm
Yes.
even ferocity that we really appreciate. But all the members of the council have been very supportive of the Parks Department. We do appreciate that.
We'll keep working on it together. All right, so I think that's a 3-0 for the staff recommendation, which strikes a balance, and then we'll revisit if we have to. Okay, thank you. All right, so I think now we're going to turn, we're switching order here. So we're going to go to item number 3, which is well, we're switching order. I'm trying to find my notes here. We're going to go to the bill 11-19, Administration Internal Audit Inspector General Amendments. Hello? Hello, Ms. Limarcy. Mr. Burgley is here as well. So this bill, 11-19, just to set the context, it was sponsored by lead sponsor of the Audit Committee, introduced on May 7th, 2019. And basically, the idea is to improve the legislative oversight of the county's internal accounting and contracting processes. And the bill will require the Office of Internal Audit to prepare an annual work plan for approval of the Chief Administrative Officer and submit the work plan to the council for comment. Also, it requires the office to submit an annual report to the Inspector General. The bill expands the Inspector General's duties by requiring the Inspector General to conduct a risk analysis of the county's internal controls and processes, and based on the risk analyses, conduct a systematic rotating group-by-group review of the internal accounting and contracting processes and controls used by each department and principal office in the executive branch. The bill also requires the Inspector General to audit each completed county contract funded in the operating budget with a contract value greater than $1 million. I want to also acknowledge that our new Inspector General, Ms. Megan Limarcy, which is her first time in front of our committee, has also shared her thoughts on some possible amendments for the legislation that I know Mr. Drummer has also incorporated in the packet, and we'll go over that as well. And of course, Mr. Broglie will be happy to also hear from you in terms of any thoughts you have on the legislation. So with that, unless my colleagues have any thoughts, Councilmember Feets.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just wanted to thank my colleagues. Again, it's kind of getting to be a thank party, but that's a good thing. First of all, I echo the Council President's comments. Really exciting to see you sitting across from us here in this setting. We're used to sitting with you, but not across from you, and so this is a nice change. And to that point, thank you. We got a chance to sit down and talk about this legislation. I think the Council President and Vice President thought it was really important for us to wait until we had a new Inspector General to be able to move forward with this. I'm glad that we did. I'm glad that we have. I think that we have now improved the legislation that the three of us have been working on, basically since the day I joined the council, since this new council was constructed as a way to really beef up and strengthen our audit functions and to really strengthen the oversight role that the council has, and that is what I think a core function of the legislative branch. And I think this has been a very deliberative process, a very thoughtful process. I think it was made better by waiting for you to be on board and to be able to weigh in. I appreciate your amendments. I think they're very thoughtful, and I'm supportive of those as well. And I just appreciate the commitment that the three of us have had, and the two of you in particular have shown to this issue, and the fact that this council is really taking its oversight responsibilities seriously, and really use this opportunity as a new council and a new executive to look inward and try to figure out how we could improve the way that we oversee every dollar that is spent, that are public dollars. They're not our dollars. They're the citizens' dollars, and to make sure that they're being invested efficiently, effectively, and appropriately. I think this is a really important step forward. We can't solve every problem, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to solve as many problems as we possibly can, and to strengthen processes and the way that we do business here. And I think this really is a great reflection of that. And I also appreciate the executive branch and the collaborative approach that the executive branch has taken with the three of us as we've looked to take on this big issue and do it in a way that makes sure that you can do your job in the executive branch, that we can do our job in the legislative branch, and to make sure that the public can feel confident that that their dollars are being invested in an appropriate way, in a responsible way, and in an effective way. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Drummer, if you can walk us through the packet, and we'll pause if we have questions. And
Okay. I think we've already had an overview, essentially, of the bill. A quick summary of the purpose of the bill is to move the Inspector General into a proactive mode from a reactive mode. That in the past, the Inspector General's office has been handling complaint-based analysis of fraud, waste, and abuse for the most part. I wouldn't say completely, but that's mostly what they've been doing. And what this bill is an attempt. It doesn't authorize the Inspector General to do anything the Inspector General didn't already have authority to do, but simply requires and moves the Inspector General into a more proactive mode. It also makes some amendments to the internal auditor, which is something the internal audit office is actually in our charter and is part of the executive branch. And it makes some modest changes to enhance coordination between the two and to actually report on what changes have been made with the recommendations that come out of the IG's office and the internal audit, and I believe the Office of Legislative Oversight. All three offices will at times make recommendations for changes, and this sort of pushes towards, so what happened? Did we actually make changes? As far as the specifics of the bill, the big question is, well, if you're going to move the Inspector General's office to a more proactive process, and in comparing what the Inspector General's office staffing is compared to other jurisdictions with different sizes based on the amount of the operating budget, they're understaffed. And so there is a fiscal impact to this bill. Exactly what it is pretty hard to nail down. You'll see in the packet, former Inspector General Ed Blancett took a shot at it before he left, and I believe, based on specifically the review of each contract, has come up with his own estimate. As you mentioned earlier, the committee decided to wait on this bill until the new Inspector General came, because she'd be the person who would be implementing the changes to the Inspector General's office. And she's taken a shot at, well, two things. One is looking at the bill and made some suggested amendments, which are in your packet, which I will talk about on Circle 27, and did her own estimate on Circle 26 of the increased staffing that she believes or estimates would be required to complete the work. I think we should talk maybe first about, there's a couple of minor issues that are probably easy to dispose of. One, starting on page 4 of the packet, there's an opinion from the county attorney's office that the original bill requiring the Inspector General to perform a legal audit of all contracts was imposing on their duties. There was never an intent to do that, and I believe that an audit, a performance audit, would include a look at whether they're complying with applicable laws and regulations. And that's really all that was meant. and that the language on pages 49 to 51, on lines 49 to 51 of the bill at Circle 3 are probably duplicative and not necessary, and because it's included in the performance audit that we're talking about in the first place. So we're recommending that those lines be deleted. In fact, that's also part of the recommendations from the Inspector General. The bigger issue is clarifying the Inspector General's contract review duties. Ms. Lamarzi has some suggested language. The original language would require the Inspector General to conduct an audit of each completed county contract funded in the operating budget with a contract value greater than $1 million. Now, the Inspector General, of course, has the authority under current law to audit any contract, regardless of the price. And but her suggestion is to not be as specific to require a look at each contract, but rather, if you look on Circle 27, to say conduct audits of high-risk county contracts and agreements, leaving the determination of whether it's a risky contract essentially to the Inspector General's office. I should say, maybe I probably skipped the executive's revised amendments. The original, I'm not going to go over what the executive originally requested because they've changed their recommendations, and it doesn't make sense to talk about recommendations they're not recommending. So we'll talk about what they are recommending. That's in the packet as well, and that's on Circle 19. Now, it was pointed out to me after the packet went to print, I may have not made this as clear as I could have. The only changes that are recommended, unless I'm misinterpreting it, from the executive are highlighted in double underlining and shaded in gray. The rest of the bill, and they just deal with the work of the internal audit office. And the major difference is that the bill has the Inspector General, in consultation with the internal auditor, conducting a risk analysis to identify areas of risk and accountability systems. The executive would like to keep that with the internal auditor. The initial analysis of risk analysis for programs and accountability systems, and the Inspector General, Ms. Lamarzi, is in agreement with that. And so in coordination with the language, the minor language changes that the executive requests on Circle 20 and the beginning of the IG amendment on Circle 27, eliminating essentially the first paragraph, would have the Inspector General out of the initial routine risk analysis, and would simply have the Inspector General making decisions on contract review based on what the Inspector General felt were high-risk contracts. So if you look at it's on Circle 20, the executive is asking to ensure that the internal auditor periodically conduct a risk analysis, and then based on the risk analysis conduct compliance, internal control, performance information system is really not, is a little more specific for what they're supposed to do, but doesn't really change what they're supposed to do under the charter. And then also the bill requires the internal audit office to prepare a annual work plan for approval by the chief administrative officer, and that would be sent to the council for review and comment each year. The executive would just like to include that the work plan must include the risk analysis and audits required at the top of the page, which is, in council staff's estimation, reasonable. So those amendments, along with the beginning of the IG amendment, I believe are reasonable. And so back to the contract review and the IG amendment. And I don't know if you want to go through these amendments one at a time or just continue on with all the amendments that we're recommending. But essentially, we're recommending the executive's amendments on Circle 20 and the IG amendment on Circle 27, which has several parts. That one is removing the risk analysis, the original risk analysis, periodic risk analysis from the Inspector General, and requiring the Inspector General to conduct audits of high-risk contracts at the Inspector General's discretion. What's a high risk? And also including language to make it clear that none of the mandatory duties that are above in any way eliminate the general authority the Inspector General has to do a review and audit in the public interest. Maybe it'd be a good time for me to stop talking.
All right, let me turn it over to our Inspector General just for any comments. I mean, I think, I heard the review of all the different amendments, and we looked at them, et cetera. I don't have a problem with them, but I wanted you to be on the record in terms of why you forwarded these particular amendments.
Thank you, and good afternoon. It's so nice to see all of you again. Mr. Drummer has definitely wrapped up most of my concerns. As I looked at the bill as it was originally drafted, I really was worried that we were going to face a situation where the OIG desperately wants to do this kind of work and may potentially not be in the position to do that based on resources. And so I'll hold on that for a moment. And also, some of the language was very prescriptive. And as we've seen in the county recently, just looking at a contract over $1 million may not really get to the heart of the oversight and the review and the recommendations that the council and the executive both want in order to ensure that we are being fiscally responsible and watching over the programs and how the funds are spent here. And so the recommendations that I brought forward were really to ensure that we have the flexibility to be nimble and address things that will come up on a risk analysis and also things that come up on a day-to-day basis. And the idea of the Office of Internal Audit doing the periodic risk analysis that's contemplated in A1 of that section, the OIG has no problem with that. For the reason that if the committee accepts the recommendation put forth in the latter part relating to the OIG's responsibilities, if we go around and do systematic reviews of each department, we would conduct a more timely risk analysis at that time anyway. So to require that they do one in the law and not have us part of that, I think maintains the independence of the Inspector General's office. And just so everyone knows, we would still do that. That is part of any good audit that would be performed. There was one other place in what was proposed, and I think Mr. Drummer cleared it up, that he was supporting the executive's amendments on page 20. The executive had some amendments at Circle 22 that I think my language would supersede. So obviously that's what I prefer in that part of this. And just lastly, there is a section I at line 62 that would need a little cleanup as well, to ensure if the committee accepts the recommendations that I've made. In I, it would need to say at line 62 that the work plan must include the systematic reviews and audits required in subsection H, taking out that risk analysis language. And that I didn't see in the packet, and I just wanted to make sure I brought to the committee's attention.
Thank you. So Berkeley, anything you'd like to?
Just 2 points. Again, I think Mr. Drummer has summarized the the changes and the basis for the changes that the executive branch was recommending. It may seem as though we changed our proposed amendments, but the reality was that once Ms. Lamarzi came on, we had a chance to chat with her. We said, let's step back from suggesting any changes to the IG section and let Megan put her fingerprints on that. That seemed to me the more prudent thing to do. The changes that we recommended on making explicit the responsibilities to conduct risk analysis is actually very consistent with the role and responsibility that we see that the executive has with respect to determining the effectiveness of the internal control system within the county and being able to identify where there are weaknesses and or gaps in the controls that need to be addressed and making sure that appropriate corrective actions are being taken timely and fully to address those gaps. So obviously we're fully supportive of Mr. Drummer's recommendation. The second point I wanted to make was we had originally proposed to include in the bill the establishment of a risk governance committee. We felt we didn't need to do that through legislation, and in fact the Chief Administrative Officer has moved ahead and established a risk governance committee, established the roles and responsibilities of that committee, and actually convened the first meeting of that committee earlier this month. And we see that as frankly enhancing by bringing together the major what I'll call corporate offices, OMB, the CIO, finance, procurement, county attorney's office, and internal audit, allows us a better opportunity to discuss what are the threats and the vulnerabilities that the county is dealing with and may likely deal with in the future, and how should we be addressing those and managing those in an effective way. So we think that doesn't need to be in legislation, but we think it's a very positive step moving forward.
Thank you. Before I turn to my colleagues, I do want to note one of the things that Ms. Lamarzi pointed out was the issue of resources. This is a significant shift in the Office of the Inspector General. Obviously, we all feel very strongly that it is important to strengthen some of those types of functions in the Inspector General's office because it is no secret that we've had some issues in the past that we would like to ensure never happen again, and that this is a way for us to be able to provide with our independent structures such as the IG, strengthening that, et cetera. But we do need to think about the resources necessary. And in our packet, I think you see on page 3, oversight functions in other jurisdictions. You look at different jurisdictions like Baltimore City, Prince George's County, of course, District of Columbia. It's a little different because we understand that they kind of function as both, the city and state all in one. You look at Fairfax County, you look at, the way that they are structured. Some areas are a little different, but when you look at the total budget, is definitely, you can see that we're in the low end. And so, I did ask Mr. Drummer to just draft some language. I know that in bills, we usually do not explicitly include language that refers makes reference to, ensuring the operating budget for a particular office is sufficient to provide the services required by the section. But it also doesn't hurt. I think that in this case, only because, for me, it was an interesting exercise almost every year as we would ask our Inspector General whether, he had sufficient resources, and the answer was always yes, yes, yes. I just feel, at least as one council member, that in this instance, it may be appropriate to just include that language as a reminder, given that this is a significant change, that, we can't set these expectations unless Ms. Lamarzi has the resources to carry out this very ambitious, shift that we are also committed. And so I would just let my colleagues know that there is language that Mr. Drummer has drafted, which basically it says that after line 72 of the bill, to just council responsibility. The council must ensure that the operating budget for the Office of the Inspector General is sufficient to provide the services required by this section, is what he suggested for us. So it's something that we can discuss and see if we feel that we want to include.
I think we need to do it.
So that's the thing. Councilmember Friedson.
Well, first of all, thank you for that. I think that it is something that should be an expectation in legislation that we have, that we fully believe that we are going to not just create mandates, but actually have the full intention of funding those mandates. And so I am in enthusiastic support of that recommendation, and would just cannot express enough how much I agree with it, because the whole purpose of this isn't just to make sure that we are demonstrating our commitment to oversight, but it is making sure that we're providing the tools necessary to do the oversight and to provide the public with the faith that we are doing the job that they expect us to do as a county government. And every part of county government, the independent inspector general, the executive branch, and the legislative branch. I think the language as proposed by council staff, as proposed by the council president, reflects that, and I am in full agreement with that, and am totally appreciative of that. And I think, from the get-go, we have discussed as this committee that we don't invest enough money in oversight. And if you look at the presentation that has been before us, that is again part of this packet, and you look at the amount of investment that we place in this, budgets are about priorities, and we just haven't invested enough money in this. And everybody recognizes that budgets are difficult and that there are a lot of competing priorities, but we either put a significant value on this or we don't. And so I think this language will compel us to do what we know we need to do, and will compel all those involved to commit to it, from the time that the budget is proposed by the executive branch to the not just this inspector general, but inspectors general moving forward. This is just the expectation that this council expects in any budget proposals, that this is the type of work that we expect to be done. This is the level of oversight that we expect to happen, and we expect that it be fully funded in order to achieve that. And I think this is reflective of that. And I think we've said from the beginning, in order to achieve that goal, it's going to require public dollars. But I think it will far more make up for that in public trust that we will get from taxpayers who believe that we are doing what we ought to be doing, which is looking after their hard-earned dollars and making sure that they're being invested appropriately. So really appreciate that. With the two sets of amendments, which I'm supportive as well, it sounds like there's universal support of that as well on the committee. I think from the executive standpoint, we're basically memorializing and specifying what is already happening, which I think there's a value to that, and I appreciate that. I think not getting too specific on the exact structure of the committee, I think was a good move and a good thought. But I do appreciate the fact that that committee has been set up, that work has begun. I think that it's important work, and I do appreciate the fact that the recommendations and the amendments as proposed would demonstrate the work on the executive branch, but also the requirement of approval by the legislative branch. And so it strikes, I think, the right balance with the Office of Internal Audit and its role in the charter, which is specific. And to the points of the Inspector General's recommendations, which I also think are important. I think, one, ensuring the independence, which is critical. It's the single most important aspect that an Inspector General has, independence and integrity, of which you have both, but this would legislate make sure that the independence is maintained, and so I appreciate that aspect. And I think it was never the intention of the legislation to be overly prescriptive, and I think your amendments reflect that, and we struck the right balance of making sure that the expectation of what we want to see and to provide the Inspector General with the tools to do the type of oversight that we are talking about is there, without being overly prescriptive or in any way jeopardizing your independence, which is sacrosanct to your role. And so I appreciate that. And I think with all of the amendments, as we've discussed, they change the letter of the legislation, but are very much in keeping with and consistent with the spirit of why it was proposed and why we all, three of us, have been working on this since early on in this term, and I look forward to moving the needle on this, getting it done, and making sure that we fund it. And so I really do thank again the council president for putting that proposal forward and making sure that the expectation is, which I think we've always had, but now is going to be memorialized, that we don't just intend to set out in goals, we intend to fund those goals and execute those goals to make sure that we're doing what we say we're going to do.
Councilmember Katz, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. Morrison.
Well, and I'm going to be very brief. I agree that we should fund our mandates. I know that's really out there on a limb, but, and I especially believe we should fund this mandate. With this, the expression, put your money where your mouth is, really comes back to us. We've had some extremely bad examples of when something was not done properly, and we know the oversight that you all need to do. I agree with the amendments, and I look forward to supporting this.
Thank you. Mr. Morrison.
Thank you. And if I can just speak for a second on the record we've had discussions, and my goal will be with these added required duties really to bring you timely, accurate, and actionable information. And it will not be an absolute catch-all for every bad thing that could possibly happen here, but it's an important start. And I want to be very deliberate in how I implement this. To stand up in an audit division will take planning and time. The fiscal impact statement that I put before you, I spent a lot of time working with the staff in the Inspector General's office, who had already spent a great deal of time with Mr. Blanzett, trying to figure out a reasonable assessment to give you, and spend a lot of time analyzing on the state level what the Office of Legislative Audits does and the time it takes for them to complete an audit. And in my own personal experience, having been with them when I was an Inspector General on the state level, an audit from the moment you start it to the final exit conference of a rather small program can take 6 months. A larger program can take well over a year. Medicaid took us nearly 2 years. So it is a very long process, and it also requires a lot of front-end work in planning the audits and setting forth a reasonable audit program. And so in the fiscal impact statement, I do want to start with this as soon as I can. But at this moment, we don't have the resources to do that, and it will require bringing in folks that have that audit background and have the capabilities of working with me to create an audit program. And the chart that's in the packet is great in showing you a comparison of the number of people in the different jurisdictions and what the budgets are of an Inspector General's or an internal audit kind of office. What I found even more telling when I looked a little closer was looking at the full dollars in a given jurisdiction. So in Montgomery County, we have a budget, an operating budget, over $5 billion. And we're investing roughly right now $2 million in overseeing that with 7 people.
Right.
For comparison, Howard County has a $1.2 billion budget. They also have 8 people and a budget of $1.2 million. We certainly can't get to everything with what we have. And so I very much appreciate all of your support. I think the rest of the council has indicated will be supportive. I know the county executive and I met, and he has a lot of hope and faith in our office too. I want to bring forth information that will help everyone and protect the resources of this county and serve all of the citizens of our county. And I'm just going to ask that you help me do that.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, and that's why I brought that up, because I think that, as it usually, of course, we have to be very transparent as we explain to our constituents why it is that we make the decisions we make, especially when it comes to budget. I think this chart is very telling in that this is a very important investment. This is not just wanting to put more money out there to create, more bureaucracy. This is really, truly a very important investment in ensuring that our oversight capacity is fully, it's well resourced. And when you do look at this chart and you compare it to other jurisdictions that have, as you pointed out, budgets that are much smaller than ours, they're obviously investing more. And so, so I think this is definitely a very defensible investment that we need to make in order to shore up and strengthen your office, because we definitely have to be very cognizant of the complexity of this particular county budget and county operations, so county government. So I really appreciate those thoughts. Okay, so I think that where we are, I'm seeing nods, but I know that we have, and we reviewed the amendments that you described. I did not hear any objection, but just a lot of nodding.
Right.
So I don't know if you have a summary, or are you good in knowing? Yeah,
Let me
let's
just
do
go
that.
over what I think happened.
Millions watching it.
Yeah.
Right, for,
That's what we did. Yeah.
for Councilmember Jawando and the other millions that are
I
watching.
bet he's not even watching.
Oh, I'm sure he is.
Yeah.
The executive's amendments that appear on Circle 20 are approved, 3-0. There are the amendments that are in shaded and double underlined. Then the amendments that appear on Circle 27, labeled the IG amendment, amending lines 42 to 54 are approved. Then there was an amendment that Ms. Lamarzi mentioned, I believe would be on line 67 of the bill, to take out risk analysis because that was moved. I want to make sure I get that one right because I don't have that in the packet. Just take out the word risk analysis, or?
Yes, it would take out risk analysis, that is on line 67. And suspending review and audits require this, that's it.
Okay, and then the last one was the language that you read that I had drafted for you, that's not actually in the packet, to require funding. Just a quick word about that, which I know you understand, but you can put that in the law, but if comes budget time, 5 council members don't put the money in the budget, that would supersede this provision for that year, because the council's budget resolution is considered legislation and would supersede, at least for that year, and the following year you'd have the same obligation. So essentially, it stems from the principles you can't bind future councils and you can't bind yourself to fund something, but it does what you said. I mean, it does create expectations, and it's not the only time we've done something like that in the code.
Right.
Just so you understand it. So that language is also to be added to the bill. We
Thank you,
still-
Madam President. Just a quick clarification on that. I think my goal of that, even though it wasn't my proposal, the brilliance of it, but I think our goal would be, at least my goal would be, to have it part of the county executive's proposed budget before it comes over, because I think what has happened in the past is that there has been an interest in increasing funding. Sometimes some of that increase has happened, but it's been at the expense of programs, and that's when it becomes exceedingly difficult, that it's not starting from, here's the expectation, it's baked into the law, the council has expressed its desire for these functions to be funded, but then it comes to the council, then the council has to make a decision between an after-school program or, whatever the case may be, or, a hunger program and auditing. And while I believe auditing are some of the vegetables that you have to eat, in terms of the budget process, sometimes it's hard to get to the 5 votes in order to do that. And so I think I just want to explain, at least from my perspective, I think that's part of the reason why this is helpful, is so that we avoid that last minute conflict of figuring out how we cut to do what our primary job is and primary role is, and to have that be baked into the, what would be expected by the council of what would be in a county executive proposed budget. Of course, we can't compel.
But I don't know that, I seriously doubt we have the authority to legislate what he's going to put in his recommendations, and they are, after all, just recommendations. I mean, the executive has his own role under the charter to recommend a budget. It's up to the council to actually adopt a budget, so.
Yeah, I think it's just setting the the point I was trying to make is just setting the expectation, not once we get to the 5 votes at the council, but in the drafting of a proposed budget to come here, that the council has already indicated ahead of time its expectation.
Right, I mean, as we discussed
Right.
fully,
It's-
I understand that this is not binding. I think it's important, though, to have it there to remind us, given the history of trying to strengthen the IG's capacity and staffing, and then when you hear from the IG saying, we're fine, it's kind of like that situation where, well, what else are you going to do? If the executive is not including more resources, and the IG is saying, I don't need it, so we can't say, no, please take it. So we're now moving into a different chapter with a different IG, with a different set of recommendations. And I just thought it would just be useful to just at least have it there so that we can refer to it if we have to. That's all. But I understand that this does not bind us in any way or mandates that we have to do it.
The other item I should just mention is timing. If this bill gets enacted, it would be effective in 90 days. There's no way, the IG is going to be staffed up to do this work in the next 90 days. There is, to hire somebody this year is going to require some sort of special or supplemental appropriation to hire more. I think she has 2 vacancies right now that are funded. That's right, isn't it? But beyond that, it would require, if you want something, and even at that, these are positions that it's going to take some time to hire. So I just point that out, that this bill is going to take effect before the IG's office is staffed up to do all this work. Or you could delay the effective date, or you could leave it the way it is with the understanding that it's going to, I'm just trying to make sure there's
Yeah,
understanding of that. And like what your expectations are.
I understand.
All right, so with that, then the bill is approved with those amendments I discussed, I guess 3-0.
Yes.
Got it.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Bergley, Mr. Marcin. Appreciate it. Okay, back to our agenda. Now we're going to go to what is in our pack agenda is item 2. And we have Ms. McMillan here. For a conversation and Mr. Son. Who else is going to be with us? Okay, so I just wanted to remind my colleagues that this is sort of a follow-up on conversations that we had regarding property disposition process. Obviously, we've all can remember that we did establish and adopt this bill, became effective, the first bill in 2012, but then also there's another bill, which is the one about reuse analysis, that we also took up. And now we just wanted to have a broader conversation about some outstanding issues. I don't expect us to obviously come up with any particular decisions, because this is really to have an overview. And I was thinking we could, go until, I guess, take about 30 minutes to have a conversation and then see what outstanding issues there might be, or if, when do we want to come back, and do we want to perhaps, or are we ready to propose maybe additional legislation, or how do we want to go about it? So I will turn it over to you, Ms. McMillan, to set us up for this conversation, and then we'll get into the discussion.
Well, you are spot on the expectations. That's good. So the idea was that this bill went into effect in 2012, the main part of the bill. You have actually, your most recent one doesn't go into effect till November 5th. But the council enacted this legislation to bring more transparency, both information to the council, but also public information around certain property dispositions. And property dispositions generally are the sale of property or the lease of property for more than 2 years. On page 1, I've shown you the exceptions to that are included in the current legislation. And at the time, the idea was not to have everything come to the council as a disposition. So when you have a license for something that is part of a county program, like we contract for childcare or we contract for a program and we put space in with that license is coterminous with the program, and so it's really handled that way. There were also issues around right of first refusal. So at the time, there was consideration around some of the exceptions that were allowed. The other thing that the council is required to do besides approving a declaration of no further need, and the declaration of no further need really is the council's agreement with the executive that the property is either no longer needed at all and can be sold, or it's no longer needed for the period of time of the lease that has been proposed. And the second thing that the council is asked to approve is a recommendation that a disposition be for less than fair market value. And fair market value in the law is determined as based on an appraisal that's occurred within the 12 months prior to the council getting the declaration of no further need. So those are the two approvals that you have in the process. There is also one other exception that isn't in the way the law was written, isn't listed with the first 6. And that has to do when a property is going to be primarily used for residential, and that's key, primarily used for residential. And then that 30% of that residential would be affordable housing, which would be an MPDU or the other types of housings that are exempt from the impact tax. And in those instances, you are provided with material terms, but there is no council decision. So there's a notice to council, but there's no actual requirement for the council to approve a declaration of no further need or the fair market value issue. I'm not going to go through, I've provided for you in the packet, I'm not going to go through all the steps, but I wanted to make sure that, remind you of the steps that take place before there's a transmission to the council. So there's an internal process between the executive departments and the Office of Management and Budget and the executive that has to occur before it comes to the council. And then when it is transmitted to the council, the first thing you receive is material terms with a 30-day comment period. And you've now amended that to also require that reuse proposals come along with those material terms. That'll take effect November 5th. Then the executive also publishes in the county register the declaration of no further need. And that period of time can coincide with the 30-day comment period. So often what you see is the council receives the material terms at the same time the executive has put the declaration of no further need into the register for that comment period. And then the council receives the declaration of no further need. The way the council has been doing it by practice is to introduce a resolution to approve so that you have something to act upon and to set a public hearing on. The public hearing is to be held with 15 days notice. The council can waive a public hearing, but the council's practice has been it's better to have a public hearing than to waive a public hearing. And so, as you know, often we have a public hearing that either has no speakers or perhaps only one speaker. But I think in the transparency issue, the council has felt it's just important to go ahead and have that public hearing. In fact, you'll have a public hearing next week on Hawkins Creamery. And as you know, when you considered that in committee, it does not appear that there's any controversy around it, but it's still important to have notice of a public hearing. The council, the current law says that if the council does not act within the 60 days, which can include an extension, that the declaration of no further need is automatically approved. You approve the declaration, as I mentioned, by resolution. In almost all instances that I can recall, you've either had a GO committee session or a joint session, depending on whether there's a subject area outside of GO. And that way there is a recommendation that goes before the council. And then you do have to specify whether you are recommending approval of the less than fair market value. So I also just wanted to say that then after the council action, and oftentimes when I've talked with the entities that are expecting the lease or the sale of the property, it's the executive that has to execute whatever contract is associated with it. So the council is really just saying that under the terms they've received, that the property is no longer needed, it can be sold or it can be leased. But it's up to the executive then to actually execute the contract, the sale, the deeds, and oftentimes there have been entities who have said, well, when is the council going to approve my sale? And I have to, very carefully explain to them the council's action means this, and then the executive branch will carry through with the actual transaction. And then, as I've already mentioned, for the affordable housing exception, that's one place where the council just receives notice rather than having to have a declaration of no further need. So I think generally, actually, the process has done a lot of what the council has intended, which is to have informed the public, given the council opportunity to have a discussion about a disposition. I can only recall, I think it's worked really well. Executive staff has always been, really helpful with council staff. And there's only really two places where we probably would say the council didn't end up agreeing with the executive, and one of them was on the MCPS school bus depot, because the council determined there was no alternative and so did not approve at this time a declaration of no further need and ended up disapproving that. And then we had a potential disposition in the new Silver Spring Library, and after several work sessions in that instance, the executive's proposed tenant withdrew their application for that space. And so those were two instances where the council had a lot of public consideration of it. And I think actually in those instances, it was very good that there was public consideration of it. But the issue is now that the law has been in effect and we've all had some experience, to get your guidance on whether there are any amendments you would want to entertain to bring back to you. The thought is to get your guidance today, and then if you had things that you thought were appropriate, we would do some drafting and get back to the committee to see whether there was an interest in introducing anything. Okay. So the first is actually to a comment about redrafting the law to make it clearer to what all the exceptions are. This in terms of the existing exceptions, would clarify a little more around the affordable housing and put it with the other ones. The way the law is drafted, it's a little confusing sometimes for folks that are reading it to try to understand exactly what that is. So if there was any interest in going back in, we would probably do some redrafting and restructuring of the way the law looks. I would just say that in terms of exceptions, this conversation has caused us to all have some conversations. And so Department of Transportation in particular has raised some issues about the way the process has to work if they have a road that they would transfer either through sale, but would be transferring to another government entity like a municipality, and the process that would have to go through. And also some of the licenses that they have for people who may have a gardening business or some other business that's in a right-of-way for a road that's planned, and whether there are any other exceptions that might be appropriate that would allow you to have a revocable license without having to go, of longer than 2 years, without having to go through the whole property disposition process. So those are two issues that have come up. Okay. Is that?
Emma Balanin from Department of Transportation. With me here is Eric Willis today. The first item, we actually have the town of Poolesville that is requesting we transfer certain roads that are actually limited or located within the town boundaries. We have no problem transferring the roads. The county attorney has decided, since we own the underlying fee, they would be subject to the disposition law. So to go through the whole process, to declare that there's no further public need, they will continue to be used as a public roadway. So little bit of a bind, or we believe there should be an exception to that, that it's not subject to the disposition law, but there is no foundation within the county law to go ahead and transfer. There is to the state, I understand in state law, but there is not in county law for us to transfer to another jurisdiction such as a municipality. And if I can ask Eric to explain the other one on Montrose Road.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Eric Willis. I'm the chief of the property acquisition section in DOT. The exception we're talking about is in situations where we may have funding to do design and property acquisition, and we go out and we acquire property. But there could be some period of time, and for whatever reason, that funding for actual construction is held off for later years. And so we may have a property that's now under county ownership, and someone approaches us to make sort of an interim use of that property. As the law is currently written, I can enter into a license to have somebody, the example is the garden center on Montrose Parkway, to be there for just under 2 years. But at that point, at the end of that 2-year period, I can't renew that license without going through the disposition process. And so it seems to me that maybe there's a way to do an exception where we have not a lease, but a revocable license that gives us the ability to say, okay, we need the land now, you need to go. But that would last for longer than 2 years. It would last potentially up to the duration of that interim period until we need the land for the actual roadway. If we wanted to put a time limit on it, we certainly could. But I think that would be a worthwhile exception to where the law is written.
Thank you. Councilmember Friesen.
Thank you for that, and I think this is a really important discussion. It shows some of the complexities and nuances of this, but I specifically want to talk about the Poolsville Road issue because there's an immediate problem that we have that needs to be addressed on that, and so I just wanted to raise it here. The town brought up to us that Department of Permitting Services told Washington Gas that it's no longer a county road, that they're Poolsville roads, and so they have reached out to Poolsville to ask for permitting. Except the one problem is that Poolsville wasn't aware that it was their road, and that was guidance that was given to them literally from the executive branch, from one different agency of government telling another agency of government. We were under the impression that this was happening. The fact that this, I think I reached out in the beginning of February to try to expedite this process just on behalf of the town. It was our impression in my office that was moving forward. We were never told about this disposition problem or some type of other legal issue. I would have been happy to work with the executive branch as the district council member to work on legislation if need be to address this immediate issue, and then have the broader conversation of how we address this moving forward if that were the case. This is the first I have heard of this being a property disposition problem, and I think it would be the first that even some other executive agencies have heard that it's a property disposition problem. And so I think this speaks to not only the complexity and challenges of this particular issue with property disposition, but a fundamentally challenged internal and external communication between the executive branch with itself, between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and between the executive branch, county government, executive agencies, and public utilities and municipal government. So connected to this conversation, but separate from this conversation, we got to get this thing resolved and get it figured out, because whether we think we own it or they own it or who's responsible for it or whatever the case may be, residents are driving on it, public utilities are under it, and we got to figure out who's responsible for it. And this needs to be resolved, and it needs to resolve quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Friedson. I can appreciate that. The roadways are currently under the county's control. We have been working with Poolsville to execute a transfer subject to getting through the disposition process. I will admit, for DOT, this was news. We're struggling with getting this through the process and getting all the paperwork together and transmittal to what we're actually asking the council to do. It was, I can't speak for my partners at DPS, but frankly, it was probably premature to tell them that it was not a county roadway. They are currently county roadways. So, DPS is not here to speak to that, but it is something that is in process, and we're trying to get it over the finish line, and you should be getting a transmittal of the disposition request shortly.
In the meantime, could you get, or somebody from the executive branch, get Poolsville, Washington Gas, DPS, DOT in a room to sort out what happens in the interim? Because, life doesn't wait for the legislative process to take hold, and life is happening, and it seems like the left hand isn't talking to the right hand, or I should say maybe the thumb isn't talking to the pinky on the same hand, but we've got to get much better communication than what currently exists, and obviously different departments within the executive branch doesn't know what other departments are doing, and if we don't know what we're doing, how in the world are other levels of government supposed to know what we're doing? Are public utilities supposed to know what we're doing, and are the public supposed to know what we're doing? So if you could get that sorted out, let us know when that meeting is taking place. We could be a part of it. We don't have to be a part of it, but it needs to happen, and it needs to happen real fast.
Point taken, and will do.
Thank you.
Councilmember Cox.
Yeah, he actually touched on everything I was about to say, with the one exception. If it's still under the county ownership, then the county, I believe at this point, if there's something that Washington Gas needs, the county needs to deal with Washington Gas with working, getting the permits, working with the town of Poolsville to let them understand what we're doing. But I don't know how fast this legislation is going to go through, and this situation seems to be, moving faster than this legislation at this point. That's my concern.
Thank you, Mr. Gatz. And again, I have draft memos that we got to get to request the right action. I don't want to send something over that puts you on notice, and I don't think that's what we're doing. We're not putting you on notice. We're asking for an action. We're trying to get that all tidied up. Again, this is the first time we're doing through this, but that's no excuse. But we're trying to get the action together to come over to the council. Again, we think this is a somewhat bureaucratic process for something that should be easy, and that's why we're suggesting an exception for this situation in the future.
I think that's fair.
So Linda, you've taken those notes.
A couple other areas where council staff sort of has some of the suggestions around the process. If there are changes, we would amend the term full market value to fair market value. That's more commonly used. Also, to extend the time for appraisal used for fair market value. And I would say my suggestion here, just as a suggestion, would be 18 months. I mean, I think recently when we talked about one situation, there was a negotiation that was in good faith, a fair market value, but time elapsed. And I don't think, we've worked our way around that one, but I also think 12 months is kind of a short time. And then the only exception I would say is you wouldn't be able to use an old appraisal if the zoning had changed. But if the zoning hadn't changed, certainly longer than 12 months, I think, is appropriate given the time some negotiations take.
Let me just pause. Are we in agreement is that, Mr. Hassan, I see you nodding. Is that a good time span?
Yeah. Good afternoon, Greg Osmond, Department of General Services. Our experience is we have had to go back. Now, for some bigger projects, it probably is appropriate that you go back and revise or retouch an appraisal if you're tens of millions of dollars involved. But we've had to go back and I think the one that Linda is referencing was a relatively small transaction, and it was a little stale but hadn't changed much at all. And certainly 18 months helps with that. 12 months is a little tight because the process itself is taking about 12 months. And usually we're doing the appraisal before we start developing material terms and negotiating those types of things. And so our appraisal might be, 18 to 24 months older than, when it's on your plate, so to speak. So certainly that would help. Anything longer than that, I think, even though it's a 60-day to go and reset the clock and get a new appraisal, or at least go back and get it touched up, and that probably is appropriate on a lot of these transactions. And so 18 seems like a good spot to be.
Okay, great. Is there objection from my colleagues?
Yeah,
on that?
it's good.
We're good. That one.
Another suggestion of staff is that to delete the automatic approval within 60 days or to extend it to 120 days. And I will just say, at the time this legislation was passed, the then executive had great concern that the council would delay. And so I think that what has been shown is that the council acts in a really timely manner. But I have to say that the system of having to notify the executive within 30 days if we might extend, and then having the automatic 60 days is rather cumbersome. I think that if you were to have an automatic approval or extend time, 120 days would almost always be a workable period of time. If you wanted to keep some kind of deadline in the legislation, I would suggest 120 days, and that would also solve issues about concerns that the 60 days will end during a recess period or during budget or, any of those kinds of things. So I think either way is fine, but I would suggest 120 days if you want to keep a deadline in the bill.
Okay. Councilmember Katz? Okay.
Yeah, I do believe we should keep some sort of a deadline. I think 60 days really is not as logical. I'm fine with 120.
Without objection, I think that would be great.
Okay. And then when the bill was drafted, the public hearing was required.
I just want, you're voting on something that there's no bill in front of you.
I know.
You realize that this
You're
would
just
be
giving
something.
guidance.
You're saying
Guidance
without
to draft the
objection, we
bill.
would like to
Okay.
include that in future legislation. We're not,
Right.
there is no bill.
But we know your guidance is unanimous or not unanimous.
I'm just trying to be more clear other than the,
But if we wait 120 days, it could be a bill.
It could be. So then the other is that the bill, when drafted, required a 15-day notice for the public hearing. That's actually very cumbersome in terms of scheduling, and also I think doesn't allow the council the flexibility to move something quicker. So again, just your guidance that you would be okay with looking at a shorter period of like 7 days notice. You could always have longer, because generally your policy is to have a 2-week notice for a public hearing, but it would allow you to turn things around faster.
so can we say, I don't know, 7 to 15 or something like that? I mean, can we give ourselves that flexibility?
Well, you can always go longer.
Okay, so is this?
So right now, you can either waive a hearing or have a hearing with 15 days notice, but you can't have a hearing with 7 days notice, right?
Right.
So the idea would be if you shortened the mandatory notice, you could always have a 2-week notice like you do now.
This is just to shorten it.
It would just
That if
give you more flexibility,
I see, okay. Councilmember Friedson?
because it'd be at least 7 days notice.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sensitive to the issue, and I think 15 days is a little interesting, because normally we do 14 days, and just the idea of 15 days is
It makes us.
puzzling to me, because it's basically a 3-week requirement, which is cumbersome and can hold up the process. On the other hand, I think I'm sensitive to what it sounds like my colleagues are sensitive to, which is the idea of, we don't want it to seem like we're not providing, we're taking away public notice, because that is not the intention here. It's to have public notice, but to do so in a way that allows the regular course of business to take place, so that we don't, run into issues. So I don't know how strongly I feel. I think at the very least, 15 seems
15 is.
bizarre, because I have, all the other public notices I've seen are 14.
Right, generally you'd have 2 weeks' notice. And this, because the council, I think rightfully, wants to have public hearings, because that was your point of having transparency. Right now, it's at it puts you in at least 3 weeks.
Could we change the language, to your point, if the only 2 options that are given currently, and we have the ability to rewrite the law, so could we provide an opportunity not just to waive or have 15 days, but to provide an opportunity to waive, shorten, if it's in the public interest, or the 15 days, so that we're just adding a third option to provide flexibility, we're not taking away? Okay, thank you.
You done good.
Okay. And then I've given you a couple of discussion issues. And again, these are just discussion issues about when should the council be notified that the executive is considering a disposition. The law as written talked about early notification. I don't think that that part of the law really has come into play much, but we do have often, not always, but often on properties, there is a solicitation put out, some kind of a, request for proposals. And I think a requirement to have the executive branch just send, just notify when when there is a request, would give you a heads up that people in the community will be hearing about it, people in the community will be thinking about it. Again, we have a lot of dispositions that don't require a solicitation. In fact, Hawkins Creamery is like a good example of that. It's very specific. But I think that asking the executive to notify the council about a solicitation would be a good step.
I think that would be great.
Okay. Then a second thing is what happens when an agreement is not executed after the council has approved a declaration of no further need, and there is a new agreement later that has different terms. And so, the old PSTA, this is an example of it in the sense of the council did approve a declaration of no further need in 2014, and it had some material terms around the amount of affordable housing. That deal just did not work out, right? So in good faith, a declaration of no further need was put before the council and approved, and it didn't work out. And so the executive put out another solicitation, not exactly the same terms, but close, like a lot of affordable housing, mixed-use development. It's not, it's not like it went from a mixed-use residential development with affordable housing to an industrial use, but it has changed. And so the question just sort of is how you want to think about what kind of notice you would get so that you could have at least discussion if you wanted. Some of this, in this particular case, of course, you would get notice of a new solicitation, which might spark some things, but there might be instances where there wouldn't be a solicitation. And so I think the question just is what happens when a deal falls through and then the executive does already have authorization from the council to a declaration of no further need.
I think that would be, I think we really do need to think through that.
Yes, I do too.
Because, obviously we do have general policy agreements and priorities that we all kind of have, rallied around. So we don't want to necessarily insert cumbersome steps, but at the same time, we also we are in a position to explain to our constituents why something has changed or not. And it's difficult if we never had any opportunity to understand or at least chime in. So I would like to have further, let's think about that a little bit more.
And that's really the point of today, is just to put some stuff on the table. The next two are really sort of thoughts around the planning board process and the process for using county-owned land. And so there's two things, which is should the planning board / staff, consider a project on county-owned land if they don't have agreement from the county. So in the case of the old PSTA, it's moving forward in the planning board process, but the Department of General Services has said, like, we have a general agreement, we're okay with that. Is that a fair way to?
Yeah, more so than just general agreement, we have it under contract, but as part of that, we would provide an agency authorization, as is customary for applicants applying for some sort of regulatory application, whether it be park and planning or DPS. We often provide agency authorizations that someone's submitting an application on county-owned land, and they may not own it, and the owner of record is okay with that. And that is a form that's used quite frequently, pretty common in DGS for us to issue those when we have applicants applying for utility permits and those types of things, and then certainly for land transactions where they're going through the entitlements process but they don't actually own it yet. So for us, it's fairly common, and so we don't have any issues with what Linda's suggesting, but haven't run into it as a major problem or obstacle for us as well.
But there are a couple of, there's at least, I know, one instance where because of discussion in a recent master plan, there's discussion and submissions of concept plans that relate to parking lot district properties, and I don't believe there's been, in that particular case, like any kind of solicitation or discussion. And so, again, this is a thinking, kind of like a time to just think through through how far, sort of when planning board should question, is the county in agreement with this? Because that could make a difference down the line, especially if there's expectations about something actually being able to move forward or not. And then the other question, and this would just be a process question, is we generally have waited to hold a work session until after we receive the declaration of no further need. We could have a discussion and work session when we receive the material terms, which would be a little earlier in the process. That might be beneficial to give comments before the declaration of no further need comes over or not, but that's really sort of a council process discussion. And then the last has to do with should the executive be able to recommend and should the council be able to approve a less than fair market transaction when disposing of a parking lot district property. This is the issue you all just dealt with in 8,000 Wisconsin Avenue. Some of that, frankly, was, I think, hopefully a unique situation in that not everybody was familiar with the process, so there was a lot of delay in getting the disposition over. But in that instance, in that instance, we came to agreement about how we could handle it. But the parking lot district law, not the property disposition law, does require that the parking lot districts be made whole because their assets are supported with PLD revenues and they exist to support appropriate levels of parking. So the question is whether there should be any change, and I think this is something to think about because I think you may, especially as we focus on these housing goals, right, then there probably will be a lot more discussion about what we do with our surface parking lots and our parking garages and all kinds of parking lot district assets. And so I think it's a time just to start the conversation about how we might want to have those transactions work. And those are really the issues I just wanted to bring before you and see if you had any interest in looking at the law again.
I think these are all important things to consider. So perhaps we can begin to move forward with the ones that we said, okay, and then perhaps have another session with specific recommendations regarding this other group, and see which other elements. How would you like to proceed?
I think that sounds great. Just on the last piece, I mean, I think the affordable housing and open space, if we can have language there to, make that clear that those are policy goals that the council has consistently pushed for, and, the expectation is you might not necessarily get back, into a PLD the money for those things, but there is a greater public interest and a greater public good and, policy areas. And I think the broader idea of bringing some of these more complicated ones back makes a lot of sense. And it's been helpful for me. I thought the packet really laid out some of these issues. It's a very nuanced and complicated question because the county has lots of different assets, and those assets come with lots of different complications, and it's hard to have a one-size-fits-all law. And so, I think this is a really helpful exercise, so thank you.
Yeah, no, I really do appreciate that observation, because even we start talking about parking lots and just thinking outside the box, could there be those opportunities to do, to co-locate, right? Housing on top of, multi-level garages, or have in particular surface parking lots, same thing. How would we approach that if we got to that particular point in time? So this notion of us understanding what are our policy goals and how we marry that with our stewardship of our county-owned assets, but not make it so cumbersome that we stand in our own way of achieving those policy goals, is where that nuanced balance lies. And so the more that we can think that way, and be flexible enough, I think the better off we will be. But that, I just, just wanted to bring that particular possibility as well, because we might have the ability to do both. If we did retain the parking spots, for example, but then utilized more of the air rights instead. So anyway, great. I think this has really been comprehensive. Really appreciate your work going down this. It's always good to take time to pause and reflect and see where we are. So really appreciate all of you for being here as well. And we'll continue the conversation. We're adjourned.